So in this podcast, we're going to take a look at returning to Warhammer 40,000. Back in the day, and that might be a few years ago, it might be more than a few years ago, it might be last century, perhaps. 40K has been around that long. You were a diehard 40K enthusiast. But life got in the way. Things change, things happen. You stop playing for a bit. Now you've rediscovered your models, or a bunch of friends are jumping back in, and you're ready to rejoin the ranks of the Emperor, fight for chaos, advance the Xenos plot, whatever it's going to be. You're ready to get back on the tabletop. So in this podcast, I want to explore some challenges. I want to offer some advice, and to together kind of put together a blueprint, an attack plan to get you back up to speed. Now, if you remember the first time you learned to play 40K, or for those of you who are following my channel here, and you just started out in 40K, there's this idea that people that have previous experience like myself, or returning players, where they already know the game and everything's overwhelming, and where do you start? When you are starting from scratch, and this is true of many war games, but especially something as fluid and dynamic as Warhammer 40,000, because there's three layers to 40K. First, there's the rules. Then there's understanding your army. Think about all the units, all the combinations, all the stratagems, everything on there. Actually, there's a fourth layer. Then the third layer, that was the second layer. The third layer is all the opposing armies, all the different armies out there, understanding those armies. And then there's like this sidebar stuff where Games Workshop releases commemorative models or various updates, or we look at bringing some of the stuff in from the various board games on there, injecting that into 40K. So there's a lot of layers where if you're new to the game, yes, it's overwhelming, but you don't have any history. You don't have any baggage. You don't have any kind of like rules that are just getting messed up in there in your mind. That is the first challenge of returning to 40K. You are familiar with the system that you left. You are familiar with your player personality. You are familiar with the tactics and how things work. But this is a completely different edition. And sometimes the learning curve is a little bit harder because you want to fall back naturally onto the old tactics or just the old styles of play when they don't exist anymore. So the first thing we're going to look at, of course, and this is easier said than done, whatever you have in your collection, whatever your army is, whatever state that it's in, begin with that. Before we can even, now we're going to be seduced by the models. Probably what got you back into the game was seeing some models or picking up a kit because you just feel like building it and messing around with it, and next thing you know, you're like, I want to jump back in. But before we get to updating your army, and I've updated many of my armies in the past over various cycles, before we even get into that, we need to relearn the rules, and we need to relearn the flow of the game, because that is going to dictate, that's going to give you a little bit of a blueprint to figure out what parts of your army can you update, what parts can you keep that still work or are even still legal. And based on your player personality and where you're approaching the game now, there might be parts of your army that are worth putting back on the shelf. I won't say sell or trade, or maybe are worth selling and trading to kind of fund another part of your army. So wherever you are, just jump into games. Now, this is where we get into win-lose, especially in previous editions. If you were coming from 5th edition 40K, which was highly competitive, it's natural to want to play and win these games. Well, you have an army that is out of date. You have an army that may or may not still have competitive elements in there. And the rules, there's similarities, but there's enough differences in the flow of the game and the missions that change things drastically from that perspective. So the first part is to just, wherever you are, play some games, work through some of the missions. Don't worry about win or lose. If it's possible to bulk out your army with a friend, this is a great way. One of the things that I talk about and I've used myself in 40K and other wargaming systems, you want to get good fast. Playing games with friends, playing doubles games, you and I on one side, two other opponents on the other side, that is a great way to jump in and learn, because you don't need a massive army. Whatever a regular sized game is, You might not have all the units or the models or the pieces to do that, but if you combine your army with your friend's army, you'll have enough. By seeing 4 different types of armies on the table, even if they're compatible, 4 different ways of experiencing and implementing the tactics and the rules, it just makes things work faster on there. You do that for a little bit. You try to win, but you do that for a little bit, and that is going to give you some currency. That's going to give you some understanding at where 40K is right now, whatever that means. And then from there, you can begin to aggressively look at your army and figure out your play style. Does this work? How are we going to do it? What needs to be updated? And that is going to pull you in to 40K. Or at the very least, if you're not in a position to completely overhaul your army, maybe you want to start a second army, and for now you want to kind of play with what's going on, then it's going to allow you to kind of update and pull that new army into effect. It's going to give you time. It's going to give you a starting point. That is what I would recommend in returning to 40K. Whatever you have in the moment, start with that. Work with that, build from that on there, and see what happens.